Hello and welcome to the second session in the Constitution Unit's 2024 Summer Conference. The theme for the conference as a whole is Constitutional Priorities for the Next Government, and in this session we're looking particularly at devolution in England. My name is Alan Rennick. I'm the Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit and I'm your chair for this session. As you'll be aware, the last 2 decades have seen major changes in the structure of subnational government within England, with gradual devolution of powers to a range of new mayors and combined authorities. So in this panel, we'll be asking, how should this patchwork of devolution be built upon? Should structures be more consistent across the country? Should further powers be devolved? And if so, to whom? And what steps are required to ensure that this devolved power faces appropriate scrutiny and accountability? To explore these matters, we are joined by a fantastic panel. Akash Pown is a long-standing friend of the Constitution Unit and Programme Director at the Institute for Government, where he heads the Institute's devolution work. He was lead author on the Institute's report on completing English devolution that was published just last month. Joanie Willett is Associate Professor in Politics and Co-Director of the Institute of Cornish Studies at the University of Exeter. Her research explores the role of place in politics, and she is most recently co-author with Arianna Giovannini of An Introduction to UK Politics, Place, Pluralism and Identities, published in March this year by Sage. Travers has been conducting research into local politics for many decades. He is visiting professor in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics and director of LSE London. And last but very much not least, Ed Cox sees devolution from the sharp end, having been executive director for strategy, economy and net zero at the West Midlands Combined Authority since 2020. He was previously director of IPPR North and director of public services and communities at the RSA. So a big thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today, and welcome to the Constitution Unit's conference. It's great to see you all. Each of the speakers will make opening remarks of 5 minutes or so, after which we'll have some discussion on the panel, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. Questions will be gathered today by Lisa James, who's also on our screen. If you've got a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please write it in the Q&A function here on Zoom, and Lisa will select a broad range of the questions and read them out. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you can indicate that when you submit your question. And you might just want to note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the Constitution Unit's website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. So that is enough by way of preliminaries. I will hand over directly to our first speaker, and that is Akash. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Alan. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to, as you say, be back once again, Alan, at the Constitution Unit event. Always good to be part of these conversations, even if just virtually on this occasion. Yeah, my plan for this quick intro set of remarks is to say a bit about what we at the Institute for Government have concluded the next government should and realistically could, in our view, achieve in taking forward devolution in England over the next 5 years. And so, yeah, that is based on the paper that Alan kindly mentioned, A New Deal for England, published in May. And so in that paper, well, first of all, we argue that the devolution deals implemented over the past decade or so, the establishment of metro mayors and combined authorities, the transfer of power in areas such as transport, skills, housing, and so on, have genuinely shifted the dial in a welcome direction towards a more decentralized political system in what does still remain in many ways a highly centralized nation, talking about England rather than the UK as a whole. But there has been, despite, I think many people tending to look at things in a glass half empty way, in our view, there has been that genuine shift of power. We also take the view that the geography of most of the devolution deals has been broadly sensible, based around city regions, functional economic geography, travel to work areas, and so on. And I think we are broadly favourable towards the mayoral model, controversial in many parts of local government, of course, but in our assessment, most of the mayors elected have demonstrated the benefits of that model in terms of the ability it gives mayors to use their mandate to set and drive forward a regional agenda, and also to represent the region in national debate, in negotiations with central government and business and so on, in a way that a group of local leaders typically cannot. Clearly, it's not worked perfectly everywhere. Some of the combined authorities, I think it's quite clear to say, have faced some quite serious governance and leadership weaknesses. But overall, those are in the minority, in my view. And overall, our view is this is a model that should be refined and built upon. And I think it's welcome, actually, that the Labour Party, assuming they do come in next month, is of the mindset that it shouldn't be trying to reinvent the wheel of regional governance in the way past governments have done. So how then do we think the model can be and should be refined and expanded? So our report has a lot of recommendations. Obviously, it'd be great if people read it. I'll give a few highlights. So first of all, we think it's important that the next government sets out a clear commitment and plan to extend devolution to the rest of the country. About half the country is covered as of now by mayoral devolution. And the places they've started with, as mentioned, have been the urban regions, because devolution is viewed primarily as part of a sort of economic growth agenda. But our point would be, it's not only that, it's also a democratic reform agenda. It's about giving often overlooked places a louder voice in national debate, and we think the commitment should be there to extend devolution to the rest of the nation. That being said, a government's not realistically going to be able to do this everywhere all at once. So we do think it makes sense to prioritise additional devolution deals or settlements in the large urban areas that have been left out as part of a first wave of devolution after the election. And that would mean implementing the provisional deals already agreed in places like Humberside and Lancashire, and then prioritising new devo agreements in regions encompassing big cities like Leicester, Southampton, Stoke, Portsmouth, and elsewhere. And we set out in quite a lot of detail the specific places we propose prioritising. That also means, we note, that in some cases, central government, paradoxical as it might seem, might ultimately have to, in some cases, decide the boundaries of devolution. Because if it doesn't, if it just lets this come completely in a bottom-up way, you will end up, we already to some extent have ended up, with little bits of the country left out, devolution exclaves, as we call them. So ultimately, while working with local politics as far as possible is the best way forward, sometimes central government might ultimately have to decide. In terms of the powers on offer, we advocate deeper devolution in areas that I think at the moment are best described as semi-devolved, even to the leading regions like West Midlands. We'll hear from Ed about in a minute. So local transport, housing and planning, skills, local growth funding, those are sort of the partially devolved areas that there's scope to move forward in. There's also kind of areas where less has happened so far that we would call for significant devolution of employment support. It's in the Labour manifesto, powers relating to and budgets relating to net zero, decarbonisation, energy planning, things like that as well. We'd like to see a bit more openness to fiscal devolution as well than either party seems to have appetite for. And as part of all of that, this is largely about control of money, so funding simplification, single settlement type model, extending that to other areas, I think is crucial too. Finally, a little bit, this is the Constitution Unit Conference on the kind of constitutional status of regional government. So two different things I'll say very briefly. First of all, we've advocated for a while that there's a need for reform of combined authority constitutions, essentially to reduce the number of veto points that make it very hard to get through things like regional spatial strategies, which are going to be really crucial to, again, assumption of Labour government, really crucial to their economic growth and house building objectives. So that's one area we'd like to see reform. The second thing is, I think, what we could call greater constitutionalization of regional government, recognition of this as a tier of government in its own right, statutory underpinning of the powers that are on offer. We call for things like a devolve or explain principle or convention, whereby if a power is devolved somewhere, any other place with the same kind of institutional setup should be able to bid for that power and receive a reasoned response from the centre. There's loads more I could talk about, but I won't. But hopefully that's given a good sense of where our assessment is of progress made and progress to be made. So back to you, Alan. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Akash. Lots to get our teeth into there. Let's move straight over to Joanie.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's a real pleasure to be here, geeking out about all things devolution based. So I'm Joanie Willett. I'm co-director of the Institute of Cornish Studies, and as somebody, some of you may or may not be aware, but people in Cornwall have wanted more decentralisation for a long time. So I remember back in the 90s, actually, I wasn't particularly politically conscious in the 90s, but one of the things I did pick up on was that there was an enormous campaign for political decentralisation, and in fact, Cornwall was one of the first, along with Manchester. Cornwall was one of the first regions to be granted devolution in 2015 as part of this latest wave of devolution stuff. And one of the things that makes Cornwall very, very different is that it's also a very rural area, and it's not a combined authority like in the other parts of the UK. So kind of against that backdrop, devolution and political decentralisation, the need for it, living in a place that experiences an enormous amount of inequality compared to other parts of the UK. These are all kind of questions that have felt very personal to me. So I want to get out there right at the beginning, because I might for a little while make it sound a bit like I think that devolution is a bad thing, but I just want to get out there right from the beginning that actually I think it is really important. But I think it's also really important to remember that it can be absolutely awful. And we're kind of unique in the UK, as in that we are one of the parts of the world that is the most, that has the most centralised governments. So the UK is currently incredibly centralised. So we're talking from a different kind of playing field. However, one of the things that can be quite interesting looking through the academic scholarship is the way that actually scholars around the world are not unanimous that decentralisation is a good thing. And in a lot of other parts of the world, you'll find that people are actually calling for more centralisation. So, for example, I spent a lot of time last year in the United States. Hugely decentralised politically and economically, and enormously. I mean, like every single town has their own police department and fire department. That is unreal from a British perspective. The amount of control that local government has over what happens, and also the amount of fiscal decentralisation that they have too, varies from state to state, and varies sometimes within states as well. So you can't sort of say as a blanket thing. But the amount of fiscal decentralisation is really quite astonishing from a UK perspective. But what's also really fascinating is that as a pretty liberal academic in the US, talking about local government and local government decentralisation, I found that it was necessary to kind of get out there right from the beginning that I was not some right-wing, libertarian, pro-Republican leaning kind of person, because that was where the stereotype was. Because in the US, there's a massive amount of kind of mobilization for a lot more centralization. And why I'm saying this is that there are some things that work really, really well, but there are also some things that really don't work at all. And I feel that in the UK, one of the things that we need to do absolutely urgently is to explore an evidence base, or a solid evidence base, for the kind of things that we are looking for. And we need to be looking outside the UK to other parts of the world for, ideas that work well, and of course cautionary tales as well. So one of the things that I found, so one of the little stories that I've got about the US was a town of about 10,000 people that put an extra cent on sales tax, and from that were able to put down a down payment to build a recreational centre, so a leisure centre, that then they were using as a revenue generator. So from a British perspective, it seemed absolutely fascinating, sort of this whole idea of a local authority using fiscal decentralization as a way of investing in something that they then thought might bring them in a lot more revenue. However, on the downside, some communities ended up incredibly vulnerable, and I knew of some communities that literally almost went bankrupt, or indeed have gone bankrupt, which is clearly a really an important thing that we need to understand. What was also really interesting, and I'm going to sort of dip into the mayor debate very, very quickly. What was also really interesting was the way that pretty much across the board, when you talk to people in the US about, do you want about elected mayors, they're like, oh, why do we want that? Actually, why do we want a politician to run our local government when what we really need is somebody who has the skills in running a local government rather than a popularity contest? I found that really interesting, and I think that there's a lot that we need to tease out about, about the ideas that we're having for what devolution should look like in the UK. I think we need to tease a lot more out about what works well and what doesn't work well, and what actually are good ideas that people are sort of sharing around. But we need to understand a lot more about the evidence base for them, and if there's anything particular between different areas. So for example, what might work really well in devolution in Manchester might not work so well in devolution in London or Cornwall or Devon or wherever. So we need to, it feels like we need to have a bit of a devolution toolkit for, what are the actual needs on the ground, and what are the tools that we can borrow for that. One of the things that we had to remember, I feel, and I'm going to end on this point, one of the things that we need to remember is that in the UK, we've hollowed out local government massively over the past 30 years. And possibly even more, and that means that a lot of the institutional memory and a lot of the good ideas about things that worked really well before, or about what our localities might do, are no longer there. Which means that we've got a lot of capacity building that needs to happen in our localities, I feel, sort of right the way from the start. And I think that capacity building, alongside, needs to go alongside devolution, and in a way that is accessible for all local authorities that would like to become a part of it. Thank you. That's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joanie. You've opened up some big questions there for us to get into and the discussion later. So many thanks for that. Straight over now to Tony.
Okay, well, good to be here, and excellent event. So very briefly, just to go back just fractionally, I would like to get going into the future by looking to the past. It is worth dwelling on the fact that where we've arrived in terms of devolution, with the fascinating patchwork quilt that Local Government Chronicle is regularly happy to produce a chart about, is in part because, of course, of the failure of the 2004 referendum in the Northeast. The idea that the most recent Labour government had, that somehow we'd have first London and then other regions of England all informed by a referendum, and that would create a sort of balance to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. That didn't work after the failure of the Northeast referendum, and then the abandonment of the one that was going to happen in Yorkshire and Humberside. And of course, what emerged from that, particularly in Greater Manchester, pause to mention Sir Howard Bernstein, who's died over the weekend, the leadership of Greater Manchester came together in a way that, for all time, as it were, created a city regional version of governance, subnational governance, that has now been rolled out with government support to other former metropolitan counties and to other areas besides. And the interesting thing about that is it effectively closes off for all time, apart from the northeast, any discussion of going back to anything like regions in England, because you'd have to unscramble all of these existing combined authorities about city regions, and city regions make sense. So we've now got a pattern it was to some extent set by city regions, but it's only partial. So we've now got groups of counties and then areas that aren't in any area, and begging the question, as in the UK or in England within the UK, so Whitehall will always eventually get to is, when do we need to universalize all of this and create a single structure across the whole of England? So as in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, where you've got a single tier of unitary authorities, when do we move to something with combined authorities and unitaries for all? And it's hard to get away from the fact that that is where we're headed, even if you're like me and slightly wary of reorganizations of local governments. I think it's worth banking the fact that when we do get to combined authorities pretty well everywhere, or something akin to that, with a version of perhaps slightly different versions of devolution all over England, it won't be anything like Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, even individually or in total. As I think Akash said, there will need to be a look at the accountability mechanisms for the combined authorities outside London. The London model isn't very good, but in terms of having a separate assembly to oversee the mayor, rather than the slightly complicated combined authorities with the mayor and borough leaders on it, even the London model may be slightly better. Worth adding that if we move to more and more unitaries, which we tend to, it's absolutely right that other parts of the world have many more units of subnational government. France famously has 36,000, whereas the UK, for exactly the same population, has 383. It is worth reminding ourselves how, as we reduce the number of primary authorities, sorry about that, never rings and it won't ring again now. As we reduce the number of primary authorities, then the distance between voters and the elected unit of government gets more and more distant. So just briefly to add to all of this, there is a longer term issue, it seems to me, which is how to convince the Treasury and the rest of Whitehall that serious further devolution won't cause the skies to fall in. There is this very powerful belief in national government that somehow it's as if, other countries like France and Germany and Sweden and America, they can all manage with states and councils, municipalities, but somehow Britain's democracy isn't up to working in that way. How many times a year do I hear Birmingham or Thurrock or Liverpool in the 1980s mentioned, as if that were an explainer for why you can't hand power downwards in England, forgetting conveniently about HS2 and defence procurement in terms of well-managed, not projects by national government. So we do need to convince the Treasury public spending won't get out of control and that equalisation will still be possible, even if local taxation is reformed, and a freestanding issue, but which definitely needs to be addressed. And most of local government and the combined authorities are heavily competent. They're highly competent. New combined authorities have been incredibly successful, given their slightly awkward starting point. They've matured very quickly. So I think not just the Treasury, but we have to convince the rest of Whitehall that, well, to put it brutally, it's in their own interest. There's not massive amounts of academic evidence that suggests that if you devolve power, you get higher growth in such areas. But what we do know is that trust in government increases. There's loads of evidence about this, lots of polling evidence. And on a day when a number of distinguished academics and others, some here represented, Meg, have signed a letter to the Times about the need to restore trust in government, and rightly so, devolving power would devolve it to people who are more trusted than the people who have it less at the moment, who are less trusted. So if it did nothing other than that for national government, that would be a good reason for central government to free up a bit. That's it. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Tony. And anyone who hadn't yet seen the piece that you were referring to there, which is a joint statement by the Constitution
Unit and others, I should have said that.
The Institute for Government and the Dominic Grieve-led group, the name of which I'm blanking on the, sorry, it'll come. Then you can find full details on the Constitution Unit website and also the Institute for Government website. UK Governance Project is what the other project is called. Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. Let's move straight over and finally to Ed.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks very much for inviting me to join in this panel and offer a few views from West Midlands, but also as somebody who comes at this agenda as a long-standing advocate for devolution in England. I guess I want to answer each of your questions in turn, but before I do, just to quickly say a couple of words about context, because I do think that one of the questions we need to address is what do we actually want devolution for? And I think there is a really important democratic logic, which I'll come back to at the end, but I'm going to take a stance which starts really with the economy and says that the sort of main focus for city regional devolution in England, and indeed, as Tony's already referred to, sort of what Greater Manchester were about and what the West Midlands is certainly about, is how we drive economic growth, particularly outside London. And I do think there is compelling evidence that our productivity problems stem from this over-centralised nation that other people have talked about. And, you know, Joanie's very interestingly sort of talked about the US and different debates around devolution there. But I think, you know, some of those to my mind are around sort of specific issues around local public services and so on. But if you come at it from an economic perspective, if you look at, for example, Phil McCann's work, then there's some really very clear evidence that we have very weak subnational ecosystems, which then drive investment away or out of, or not attract investment to some of our regions. I think there's evidence to suggest that population size of between 6 and 12 million is an ideal size for a kind of for subnational governance. Some of the most successful democratic nations seem to have governance at that level. So, you know, 60 million in England is far too big for that. I think there's compelling evidence too that London, Scotland, to some extent Greater Manchester, have all moved the dial in terms of their productivity in relation to the amount of powers that they've been given in order to, for example, improve their transport system. So we could have a debate about sort of evidence base for it, but I do think that the sort of real productivity problems we've got outside London and the southeast do stem from the over centralisation that we see. And I think there's a kind of knock-on problem too, which Tony has alluded to, around what I perceive to be very negative attitudes towards subnational government that are deeply ingrained in the Whitehall culture. And I think this, you know, even when you have got productivity problems staring you in the face, Treasury and others are still very resistant to letting go, partly for the risk reasons that Tony's referred to, but also because I genuinely don't believe that they have much understanding of the way in which local government has worked historically and might work in other countries around the world. So I think that's all context by way of saying sort of where I think some of the fundamental problems lie. But you asked the question, should the patchwork of devolution be built upon and structures be more consistent? I definitely think there is an argument for more consistency. I think that the argument that IFG make for completing the map is a compelling one. But I do also think that there's a risk, and this is me now with my West Midlands hat firmly on, that we could end up in government spending a huge amount of time and capacity trying to complete that map. Lots and lots of debates about the structure of local government and local government reorganisation, which we might end up with, which might mean that we end up moving at the pace of the slowest, and we remove attention and capacity from actually doubling down on some of the fantastic devolution work that is going on in places like Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, where we are trailblazing combined authorities and where we've got a lot of ambition to go much further and faster. What we don't want to see is very protracted conversations with lots of other parts of the country where there's less of an appetite for devolution, quite frankly, and we spend a lot of time and energy focused on that. And you asked the question, should further powers be devolved, and if so, to whom? Well, we would absolutely say yes. There's a huge amount that needs to be devolved. Before I get on to some of the new things, I would flag that government needs to come good on quite a lot of things that were agreed in our Trailblazer deal. The single settlement is one of the most important things that was negotiated through that deal. We are in negotiation with government about that. It seems the Labour Party are committed to it as well. They call it an integrated settlement. And there's a huge opportunity there. We have 90 different grant funding streams, all with their own different systems of monitoring and evaluation at the moment that support activity across the West Midlands region. That will go down to a single funding block, accounting for around about 75% of our funding, and that will make a huge difference spent over a 5-year period as opposed to, well, very often just 6 months. Sometimes 12 months, and it's really quite ridiculous the way in which the funding flows at the moment. And there are other commitments in the Trailblazer deal that we need to make further progress on. The affordable housing partnership, for example, bus franchising is another area where these are commitments that were made, and we now need to see them through. In terms of next steps, Akash has already mentioned some of them that I think are particularly obvious and within reach. Employment support, the apprenticeships levy, those would be quite important to us. There was a government levelling up mission commitment to increasing the amount of innovation and R&D spending outside of the Golden Triangle, and government's nowhere near achieving that. And so I think there's a lot more that we can do in the innovation and R&D space, again, to that economic logic that I've mentioned before. A lot on public service reform, which could actually massively alleviate some of the problems around local government finance at the moment if we were to do that more collectively, if there was appetite and space to do that. And then, of course, the Labour Party are promising strategic spatial planning as well. Now, that's going to be a very tricky one, even for a combined authority like Greater Manchester or the West Midlands, where we believe we've got far more mature relationships. Actually, strategic spatial planning could well be quite tricky to get over the line, unless it is, well, it will necessarily need to be mandated from the centre if we're going to move that one forward, I suspect. I think there are a couple of areas where we should see more radical changes as well. I really don't think, Tony, you mentioned this is a separate issue. I think to some extent it's separate, but it feels very real to me in a combined authority. The whole system of local government finance is completely broken. And what we find is that some of the biggest tensions between what we're trying to achieve as a region and what local authorities are seeking to achieve themselves is problematic, because local government constantly feels the pinch, and it's really the kind of scarcity challenges that the local government see that is problematic in trying to get regional collaboration over the line. If we could see local government funded more effectively, then I think it would have more appetite to actually work more collaboratively at the combined authority level. Another big area for more radical change, I think, is around fiscal devolution. I like the proposals in the IFG's latest report around a share of taxation being retained locally, whether that's national insurance or another form of taxation. I think that would be a big step forward. And again, if we compare ourselves with similar city regions or indeed similar developed nations, it is really derisory, the amount of money that we can raise and spend at the subnational level in this country, and that could unlock some real incentives and opportunities for growth at the local level. And then finally, I just come on to sort of your last question about what might be required if we were to devolve more power to actually what kind of scrutiny and accountability might be needed as well. I must admit, it's a very kind of Whitehall type of question. It kind of forgets the fact that mayors have as much, if not more, democratic legitimacy as any MP, and certainly arguably more than the Prime Minister, in that they are directly elected. And I do think that very often when we get into conversations about accountability with government, there is this surprise almost that mayors are directly elected, and to that extent are accountable to the general public, just in the way in which many national politicians are. The latest ideas that government's put forward for the Trailblazer combined authorities about MPs' questions, whereby a mayor would be quizzed by local MPs, I think we're very much looking forward to. We think it's a really silly idea, and I think it will demonstrate very quickly that the mayors know far more about their local patches probably than their constituency MPs, and it'll be very easy for mayors to sort of turn the tables on that one. So I expect that to get dropped pretty quickly. But that's something that both the former mayor and the current mayor have said, bring it on. We'll happily have more accountability if we can have more power. And I do also think that there's some modest reforms that we could make around the democratic accountability of combined authorities. Certainly things like public accounts committees, I think, is a good idea. I would love to see sort of more deliberative second chambers with citizens involved in a sort of second chamber arrangement, rather than the kind of expense of a GLA type arrangement as well. I think some of IFG's ideas around a simple majority voting system for combined authority decisions would also be good. And we haven't touched on this afternoon pan-regional partnerships as well, that other sort of mezzanine tier of potential governance in this country. And I do think it's worth exploring, what the role of things like the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine, and so on are, because again, compared to most other developed nations, we don't have that tier of governance in this country. I'm not sure there's a huge appetite for it, but I do think that it might add something to the conversation. So I'll stop there, and very happy to get involved in a discussion.
Great, thank you, Ed. Again, lots and lots to get our teeth into. So let me remind everyone in the audience that if you'd like to ask any questions to the panelists, now is the time to submit your questions in the Q&A. We've had a few so far, but now you've had a chance to hear what everyone has said in their opening remarks. It'd be great to see some more questions coming in. While you're thinking about those questions, let me continue the conversation a little bit among the panelists. And I guess it would be useful to start off by maybe taking a step back and considering, are we really sure that we want to start from here? So Akash, in your very first comments, you said that the IFG takes the view that here is a good starting point, and we should build upon the existing model. Tony, it slightly sounded as though you were, well, you didn't express a view on that, but you did say that the transition to a different model would be very different. So that doesn't sound like a kind of thorough endorsement of the current model, but more just that moving away from it would be undesirable. But I guess, there were a number of things that several of you said that might suggest that the current model is far from perfect. So Ed, you talked there about how there's evidence that the ideal size of a government unit is 6 million. And obviously we don't have units of 6 million in the current model, apart from London. I guess you mentioned the mezzanine tier there right at the end, and perhaps that is that. But we're mainly focusing on a much smaller tier here. Tony talked about how we've kind of stumbled upon this city-region model through the work in Greater Manchester. But as Joanie pointed out, that doesn't necessarily fit more rural areas. So I'd be interested just to hear a little bit further reflection from each of you, maybe starting again with Akash, on are we really sure that this is the right starting point for further work? Akash.
Well, I suppose the obvious answer to that is this is the starting point that we have. So I think, I guess from my perspective and the sort of IFG take on the world is to focus on practically implementable reforms, given where we're starting from, given wider political realities, yes, given maybe unfair or not soundly based concerns about this stuff in Whitehall and Westminster. We live in the real world, so I think I try to practice the art of the possible in these kind of debates. And so therefore, I mean, in terms of, is this perfect? No, of course it's not. But what we would argue, what we argue in our paper, and I was trying to argue, is I think we can move from where we are now, which is something messy, incomplete in many respects, inconsistent in terms of performance, as well as the nature of the settlements, all of that stuff, to something that is more consistent, is more clear, based on a clear set of principles, a standardized offer to all parts of the country, even while recognizing that, I mean, Ed was talking about this, it's totally not credible to expect all places to become like Greater Manchester or West Midlands overnight. We have to allow places to move at different speeds. But I do believe there's scope to do this within a more consistent, transparent framework that's more clearly based on some established principles. And I don't know exactly whether that's what we're going to get, but I think, the Labour Party, again, we're sort of slightly assuming election result, but they are talking that kind of language at least. They've talked a bit about completing the map, although it's not in the manifesto. They've talked about there being a sort of statutory underpinning for this stuff, Take Back Control Bill, which is in the manifesto with basically no detail around it. So I'm not quite sure what we're going to get to. But yes, I mean, I think that's what I'd say. I mean, the other thing, just to add, I think the boundaries are never going to be perfect. There's always, different ways one could go about it. I think over time, with sustained commitment, what we would also like to see is, well, in some places, yes, unitization would help, but also alignment of other public service and administrative boundaries with the devolution map, because that also makes it very hard to coordinate and really get the value out of this stuff when you've got all different public services and bits of the public sector operating on different geographies.
Tony, should we go to you next? Sounded like you probably share Akash's perspective on this.
Yes, I mean, it is the starting point. I completely agree on that. I wasn't actually just scrolling away. I was doing a bit of research. But in a sense, the current model isn't really a model. I mean, it's just a series of, some of which heavily developed models, some don't exist at all, and then Cornwall, for good, perfectly sensible reasons, being surrounded on the sea, on three sides, would be complicated to involve in a combined authority of the sort that is more easily done for a city. So, I can see there are all sorts of good geographical reasons why it's never going to be very easy. And we have got, I don't know how many different models, but 7, 6, I don't know, 8, something like that. If you include the different tier level models, and London's different to Manchester, which is different to West Midlands, and they're all different to others, and so on. Now, that may not matter, we don't want everything to be too tidy, but there is, I do think, space between having a system that's too hard to describe, with so many different versions of devolution, and therefore very hard to keep track on, what's happened to trailblazers. I learned from Ed that, the perfectly rational idea of trailblazers perhaps hasn't got quite as far as we'd all have hoped. And it's very hard to keep, it works from Whitehall's point of view. If you have lots of different versions of devolution, it's almost impossible to find out what's going on anywhere. And I'm afraid that is, I'm sure it's not deliberate, nearly sure it's not deliberate, but it has that effect. So I do think we need something, going back to something I said, it looks like an England version of devolution. This is supposed to be add up in total to devolving power within England so as to improve the quality of government. It's got to be about that. Make government more trusted. It's got to be about that. There's got to be purposes for it. But I do think that, you can have too much diversity, and there really isn't a model. We're not heading for a model, and there isn't a model.
Joanie, it sounded like you might have a slightly different view on this, and keen for us to think the fundamentals through again.
Not necessarily a different view, but at all. And I completely take the point about how we need a model, whilst it's tailoring to local needs is really, really important. That does become really patchy. Nobody knows what's going on and all of these kind of things. But I think the thing that is deeply concerning from a rural perspective, the thing that is deeply concerning with the whole devolution debate in England right now is that it is very, very urban focused. 90% of England, 90% is rural areas, and not all. The big issue for rural areas is that somewhere between 17% and 20% of the population live in them. So we're talking about a minority of the population living in the majority of the land. So I do understand the way that cities with their much bigger populations come to dominate the debate, but it does mean that we end up with a set of narrative that basically says urban is gold standard and everything else is just kind of like not, needs to be more urban, or these kind of stuff. And we also end up with models that are designed with urban areas in mind and completely overlook the amazing stuff that happens in rural areas. From an economic development perspective, this is really, really problematic. So time and time again, we get, from a rural perspective, we're told that, people don't really understand what the rural is for beyond it's pretty. So there's some aesthetic value. So maybe the rural areas can do tourism. What gets missed out of these whole sets of discussions is that actually rural areas have an enormous amount of natural capital, whether we're talking about feeding the nation, whether we're talking about powering the nation in terms of wind and sea energy, renewable energy, or whether we're talking actually about geological resources. So rural areas have a massive amount, and of course biodiversity, mustn't even forget that. But so what is happening at the moment is that we've got a very urban focused model about what good devolution should look like that neglects the overwhelming majority of the space in the UK, not the majority of the population, but the majority of the space. And I think that in our discussions about what devolution should look like, we need to incorporate that. And I just wanted to put in a little plug for the Britain's Leading Edge network, which is a network of principal tier local authorities, all of which are rural areas without a major city in them, that are kind of networking together, getting together and having discussions about actually, how can we get our voice better heard in the policy agenda, because right now it's being completely neglected.
Ed, do you want to respond to that in particular? I
Yeah.
mean, you're currently very much in an urban area, but you've done lots of thinking across England as a whole.
Yeah, I think it comes back to my question about what's devolution for. I mean, I think if it has a democratic imperative, and I completely support a democratic imperative, then I think it probably is beholden upon a national government to crack on with it, make a plan and do something about it. And that needs to be comprehensive. It needs to do, as Tony was saying, be much more kind of systematic and codified. There's a very, very strong case for that. And that, of course, would incorporate all parts of England, including its rural areas. But it needs to take brave decisions in going down that particular route. And since 2004, as Tony outlined at the beginning, it hasn't had the courage to do that, and so that's a problem. And I don't think necessarily devolution is characterized as a democratic problem. I don't think we talk half enough about democracy as a nation and its importance and how poor it is at the moment. But that's perhaps a separate conversation. Certainly something the Constitution Unit spends a lot of time looking at, but isn't as well debated as it could and should be. I guess the point that I was trying to make is, in the absence of a proper national conversation about democratic reform, places like Greater Manchester and the West Midlands have had to seize whatever logic they can in order to push forward a devolution agenda. And we've chosen to take an economic route because that does seem to have some kind of logic and traction that we've been successful in negotiating from government, I would say that I think the rural economy is fundamentally important, as Joanie has outlined. But actually, what my observation would be is that in rural areas, the politicians have been unable to get their acts together in order to want and drive devolution in the way in which the urban areas have, where urban political leaders have been able to come together and agree on particular models. Rural areas have been much more slow to do that. I don't think, certainly, it might be more tricky right now, but I don't think anybody has necessarily slammed the door shut on rural areas bringing forward particular models of devolution that would enable them to have devolution deals of different kinds. So I think the opportunity is there if you want to pursue an economic logic. But as I say, fundamentally, we ought to be debating the democratic issues here, I think.
Tony, and then we'll go to questions from the audience.
Well, I can see the absolute problem of rural areas, because in a very centralized system, at its absolute crudest, the biggest places with the biggest population will get most attention. I mean, for obvious democratic reasons, but also because politicians to varying degrees worry about them. More things can go badly wrong in big urban areas than, I don't mean that there aren't bad things going on in rural areas, but it's just that things can kick off more. I was just doing I love doing this kind of thing. I was just comparing, why is it American states have such an effective voice in their democratic system? And the reason is they always have parity of esteem. So even though Wyoming, I now realize, is twice the size of England, with 1/100th the population, okay, probably about, I don't know what the population Cornwall is, it about 500,000, is it? So Wyoming has the population of Cornwall, but in an area twice the size of England. But it will have a voice in Congress, and it will have politicians who have the same balance, same number of senators. They've got a voice in Congress, but crucially, they are self-governing over everything. And until and unless we move towards being a bit more self-governing over everything, then frankly, rural areas will find it terribly hard to get a voice, given how powerful the big urban areas with, in London's case, 75 MPs. It's just, it's a mathematical certainty. And that's why proper devolution within England would allow Cornwall far greater self-determination, as it would other rural areas, which I totally agree. As somebody who's based in and researches an urban area, I absolutely see why rural areas get left out. And the models evolved are often very, very much designed for cities. The combined authority one was, the London one was, and they've now been rolled out to places where they don't really work very well, in my view.
Of course, Wyoming also has 2 senators, just like California.
That's the point. It has 2 senators. So, Cornwall would have exactly the same representation as London in that model, but no, not a bit of it.
Well, we'll be on House of Lords reform tomorrow, and maybe we'll even get as far as that in the discussion. That's the session at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Let's go to questions from the audience now. We've been having lots of questions coming in. Lisa has magically reappeared on our screens. So, Lisa, what do you have for us?
Thanks to everyone who sent in questions. We're going to start with a round on accountability, which has had a great deal of interest from the audience. So Mark Sanford starts by asking, conventional thinking in this debate has been that having an elected mayor is the best route to accountability. Is this true? If there is no elected mayor, then what does it mean to hold local institutions accountable, and how should this be done? Keith Raffin asks, if we're moving inevitably to universal combined authorities, then aren't assemblies along the lines of London's essential to ensure accountability and scrutiny? Should we progress this with a couple of pilot schemes, starting with perhaps West Midlands and Manchester? And an anonymous attendee asks, in response to the issues of accountability raised by Ed and Tony, should Metro mayors only be allowed to serve a limited 2 or 3 terms in office?
Very interesting. Thank you. Ed, I think you were probably the person who talked about these issues most in your opening remarks. So do you want to come in? And I guess particularly think about Mark's question there about is an elected mayor the best route? And you talk quite positively about it. And we tend to be quite rude about the idea of directly electing the head of government at a national level. You know, most political scientists think that presidential systems are not actually good for democracy and good government. But yet we have that model at the regional level. So what's going on there?
I mean, I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating, or we've already demonstrated that city regional mayors, whether that's in this country or indeed overseas, are a particularly popular type of democratic mechanism, and people do take an interest, and the extent to which they represent their patch, I think, gives them a level of credence that is there to support that particular model. So I would say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think there are aspects, the voting mechanism that we're using now, first past the post, is not ideal, but I do think that mayors have consistently demonstrated that they have a capacity to be able to speak for a patch, and in a way that I think it's much more difficult for a prime minister to, which is why I guess you get the critique of a presidential model in that sense. So I would say that would be the reason. But just to pick up a couple of the other questions, I do think that you can enhance accountability, but I think it needs to be, proper democratic accountability, and not silly, gimmicks like MPs' questions. So I would absolutely advocate the notion of some kind of second chamber, or some kind of assembly that would hold mayoral combined authorities to account in some way. I don't think you need anything as elaborate as a GLA. I think that's a very expensive way of doing it, and I do think it relies very heavily on another form of representative democracy. I think a form of deliberative democracy, some kind of citizens' assembly style second chamber, would be a much more interesting approach, and it's certainly something that I have advocated in the West Midlands, and we may well explore in due course. But right now, I think that's the best way. And in terms of the terms, I wouldn't say I'm a constitutional expert, and so I don't really want to comment on whether 2 or 3 terms should be the maximum, but it does feel to me as though that could be a good idea to introduce, just to introduce another layer, if you like, of democratic challenge, if I can put it in those terms, and prevent any particular mayor from hoarding power for a very long period of time.
Excellent, thank you. Long-term watchers of the Constitution Unit will know that the thought of a deliberative citizens body of some kind is music to my ears. So this is interesting to hear. Tony.
Well, to do it in reverse order, I mean, given that the idea of directly elected mayors very much prospering under Tony Blair, who was a rather presidential kind of prime minister, then picked up by David Cameron, who was very much a presidential prime minister. In the best British traditions, we inherited the American ideal, but then didn't come up with the executive legislative split that is traditional in the United States, is part of that sort of system. So we've ended up, certainly in the bigger cities, where in effect the mayor is the legislative and the executive branch, which is a bit complicated. Given how complex government is, of course I'm in favour of consultative assemblies and so on. I just think the business of government is so complicated. It's very, very hard for somebody who doesn't have a bit of resource behind them to hold, the mayor of 2, 3, 4, 9 million people to account. So I just think it's got to be reasonably professional. Totally agree with Ed. Can't be MPs. I mean, that is a confusion, a democratic confusion too far. Should there be term limits? Actually, absolutely. Although I'd love to watch MPs discussing term limits. It'd be worth it just to watch members of Parliament discussing the democracy subnational term limits bill, because I think there's so much power in a mayoral pair of hands that 2 absolute max 3 terms, perhaps not continuously, would be a very reasonable thing to consider. And I think running for 3 terms, 4 terms, we've seen from the United States, doesn't always end well.
Joanie?
And I think, or bearing in mind our previous discussions about whether we do things patchwork or have more universal standards, but I do think that we need to be a little bit aware about or thinking through about what we are using mayors for. So I'm borrowing a lot from Ed here, sort of thinking about what actually are we imagining is the utility of this particular organisation. And to the best of my understanding, the current round of of metro mayors, etc., the whole idea within this devolution process is that you've got you've got a city council and you've got neighbouring councils that need to have some way of bringing them all together. In that way, I can see that there's a really good utility of having a figurehead that is able to do that role. Does that mean that this person is necessarily accountable? I think, again, we need to really think through about what we actually mean by accountability. So, for example, Andy Burnham, who arguably is the mayor with the greatest name recognition. The turnout for his last election was 32% or thereabouts. That is a really, really low number of people. And then, of course, that not everybody voted him, although clearly a large majority did. And that's him sorted for another 4 years. So is that what we mean by accountability, or are there some other ways that the public, that might be able to feed in or hold people accountable? Is there a better way of actually doing this? And I suppose that sort of slides a little bit into term limits. It's I don't know. I really like the idea that Tony was saying about raising questions about MPs' term limits and things like that as well. I think these are all questions for debate. I don't really have a huge opinion on term limits either way, but it does seem that if we're thinking about devolution as an opportunity for allowing in new ideas, or and people with fresh perspectives, and making sure that we've always got through the people coming up through, then term limits are a good thing on any post.
And Akash. And I guess if you can be reasonably quick, and then we'll be able to get in another round.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess as I implied in my opening comments, my assessment is that the mayoral model does provide that accountability due to the that profile and direct mandate that a mayor has. Because I think if you compare it to the alternatives, when the metro mayoral model was being imposed, frankly, in most places, against the wishes of local authorities. I mean, the view of local government was, we can have a joint committee, one of the leaders from the constituent councils can chair it. Maybe we'll switch the chair year on year. And why do we need a mayor on top of that? And there's still that view, I think, among some people in local government. But the reality is, a council leader, even in a big city, they're elected by a few hundred people in their wards. They don't really have even like citywide name recognition typically, let alone wider regional recognition. They may, their position is often subject to changing balance on the local council, which might be elected by thirds and all the rest of it. I think it just doesn't work as that kind of strong, visible point of accountability when you're from the perspective of central government giving away important functions and budgets, or if this is about being clearly accountable to voters for certain functions as well. So, I mean, that's my view of that. I don't think the scrutiny model works very well at the moment. It is odd. You've got a combined authority board that is both taking decisions jointly and also sort of acting as the check and balance on the mayor. So, I mean, we think, yes, having a kind of independently funded and constituted devolved public accounts committee or something like that would be a sensible reform for the next government. Term limits, I haven't thought that much about either, but I think Ed and Tony have both made quite good arguments in favour of that. I would need to reflect further.
Thank you very much. And back to Lisa and another round of questions.
All right, we'll start with a big question from Rosa Dearden. What do you think about national devolution for the whole of England, as Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have, thinking about the West Lothian question, as English votes for English laws has been repealed? And then 2 questions on the economy and infrastructure. Chris Naylor, a former councillor and local cabinet member, says, I'm old enough to remember the offices for the regions. Personally, I'm very much a Democrat, but if devolution is primarily about economic growth, are the democratic structures of our combined authorities and city regions, structures which may sometimes be deflected by local politics, really the best way to focus on delivering growth objectives? Do we need to be clearer about their pros and cons? And finally, Michael Wells, please could the panel comment on how a project like HS2 can or will fit into a more devolved England and UK?
Wow, thank you. So big question to start off with, and then 2 more particular questions as well. I fear this is going to be our final round, so why don't we go in the order in which we started, which means Akash, straight back to you.
Okay, gave me lots of time to think about that stuff. Thanks, Alan. I mean, national devolution for the whole of England, West Lothian question. These are kind of obviously, I don't know if it's the right word, but like hoary old debates that the Constitution Unit's done lots of work on over the years, for sure. I mean, my simple answer on the English question, if you like, is the main problem that England faces is not that its interests are being ignored or overshadowed by the other nations within the Union state, like au contraire, you might say, but rather the problem England faces is it's too centralized, and that leads to poor government and contributes to regional inequality and so on. So I don't think having an English tier is a solution to an actual problem that the country faces, and would detract from, I think, what's more important, which is what we've been talking about, namely decentralization within England. So yeah, that's my view on that. I'm not sure on the other questions exactly the gist of what the office for the regions are combined authorities, what exactly is the question there, sorry?
Yeah, so Lisa, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the core of the question is, if devolution is primarily about economic growth, then are democratic structures where growth objectives may be derailed by local politics the best way to achieve that? And do we need to be clear about what the pros and cons are of trying to deliver economic growth through local democratic structures?
I mean, I think, yeah, we should be clear about the pros and cons, and we should be driven by, yeah, kind of realistic assessment of what works. Again, I think my simple view would be devolution is both about improving outcomes, economic and wider outcomes, actually, and it's about democracy. I mean, I think it ought to capture both those kind of rationales. So again, to go back to what we were talking about before, this is the model that we've got sort of semi-implemented. I don't advocate tearing up that piece of paper and starting afresh. So for me, the debate is how do we improve it and both ensure it delivers better objectives and better outcomes and works better as a democratic tier of government.
We're pushing against our time limits, so I'll let you off the hook, Akash, on the HS2 question. But the 3 remaining speakers, if you want to pick up maybe one of the 3 questions and focus on that, then that would be great. So Joanie next.
Hi, I'm just gonna try to scoop up as many of it as I can, all in the same go, if that makes sense. So, and again, really hammering home that issue around rural areas, and I think national devolution for the whole of England sounds like a great idea, but also we need to remember that actually rural areas are often getting overlooked within the space as things stand, and how would that actually be changed within this, which also kind of like slides into questions around HS2. Again, great for the north. I understand, but also there are other parts of England that also have massive issues with a lack of infrastructure that aren't even getting a look in, and in fact our infrastructure is getting worse. So so basically what I'm trying to say is we need to make sure that the institutions that we decide on are good for all of the UK, not just a utilitarian greatest good for the greatest number, but actually, that we're looking at including all of the English area.
Thank you. Tony?
I think the thing about a national government, the devolution settlement for England that was like the one for Scotland or Wales, is that it would leave the government of England, if I'm pretty sure, with a higher budget, higher spending than the UK government. Completely, I mean, England is 67 millions of the United Kingdom, and therefore devolution to England would upset the sort of accidental constitutional balance we now have between England, which is dominant, and Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, forgetting devolution and nationalism and everything. You know, England can't be that dominant, which is why a fragmented version of devolution sort of makes more sense, it seems to me. And then on the question about High Speed 2, all I can say about High Speed 2 is a classic example of a project which centralized government will go about. It is a big project, understandable by Whitehall, leads to eventually, if we all live long enough, ribbons will be cut. But if you'd imagine spending all those billions differently on the, I don't know, on providing, I choose it, not entirely at random, giving West Midlands the best metro and tram system of any city in Western Europe, we could have had it by now. I just think that the decision to spend 6 to 8 billion a year, which what is that now costs, won't go to the north, of course, or Wales or the west, is, you know, it's not going to work very well for regional productivity in the way that perhaps many people thought it might, hoped it might, but in the end, I think the same money spent differently locally could have produced significant local economic benefits. But, you know, we are where we are, as Mr. Blair used to say.
Thank you very much. And final word to Ed.
Well, it still says, actually.
Just on the, I won't pick up on the English question. I think that's been dealt with by other people. But just on the HS2 question, I think the fundamental piece here is that we are just not spending enough on infrastructure generally. There are many, many economists, globally renowned economists, that all say we should be doing HS2 and we should be doing the best metro system in the West Midlands. And our problem is that we've created this kind of scarcity conversation whereby we think we can only do one or the other, and we've done that systematically over 40 or so years, and that's really been to the economy's detriment. So but just in terms of you know, the kind of democratic question that was being asked, I think it will always be within the gift of a national government to want to do national infrastructure projects, and that's quite right. But what we also need, and what we thought we had in the Midlands and the North, was a long-term commitment from a government to carry out that national infrastructure project, which then allowed us to do lots and lots of planning at the local level in order to maximise the benefits. And frankly, half of that in the West Midlands has now been taken away from us. So suddenly the kind of business cases for a whole range of projects that we were developing are significantly undermined because national government has changed its mind on something. So you know, there's some really quite big issues there. And then finally, just on the question on you know, whether democratic institutions are the right ones to address economic growth. Well, again, I think this plays at a national level and at a local level, and to my mind is at the root of why you need democratic government. You know, yes, of course, we can take technocratic decisions about any aspect of public life, including the economy, but we do also need to have those decisions taken in a democratic context, whether that's at a local level, a regional level, or a national level. So I think, you know, we need technical decisions, but we really definitely need to do that in a democratic context.
Thank you. We could continue this conversation for much longer, I think. I've certainly got lots more questions, but alas, we are out of time. Before I ask our audience to join me in thanking the speakers, a few little bits of housekeeping. So the recording of this session will appear on our YouTube channel very soon and on the podcast feed in the coming days. Please do subscribe to those or look out for information on our website or Twitter. If you're not already signed up to our events mailing list, then please do so in order to be the first to hear about our forthcoming events. You can just follow the Get Involved link on the Constitution Unit's website. Our conference continues tomorrow with 2 more sessions. We'll be looking, as mentioned previously, at the House of Lords over at lunchtime. But the next session will be at 10:45 in the morning, when Professor Kate O'Regan from the Oxford Bonavero Institute for Human Rights will chair a discussion of the rule of law with Baroness Shami Chakrabarti, Lord Jonathan Sumption, and former Treasury Solicitor Jonathan Jones. So you'll be able to join that by using the same link as you've used as today, just before that session begins. With that, let me thank all of you in the audience for attending. And let me, on your behalf, thank our excellent speakers, Akash Pown, Joanie Willett, Tony Travers, and Ed Cox. It's been a really illuminating discussion, and I've certainly learned a lot. Thanks also to Lisa for fielding the questions, and to Ed and Rowan behind the scenes for making everything run so smoothly. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.